Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, hope you enjoyed your lunch. Welcome to the first plenary session. The session will be moderated by Dr. Sheldon Sheffer from Asia Pacific Regional Network for Early Childhood, ARNEC. The stage is yours.
I think I've never been welcomed by such music before. First of all, I'm very honored to be here as the chair of the first plenary session of this conference. As a fairly minor member of the working group on mother tongue-based multilingual education, I just want to express appreciation to all of those who have in fact worked to plan and organize and implement a conference like this. It's not easy. Having experienced several of these, I know that not only is the task a difficult one, but the issues are becoming more complicated, and therefore the planning arrangements also. So work well done to all of the organizers. I'm glad to say that I think this first plenary presents a very fascinating interplay of various issues and perspectives, in fact, taking off from those of the keynote speaker this morning. They talk about a combination of theory and practice. There is a global perspective in terms of language and the Sustainable Development Goals, and also, secondly, a specific example in the Philippines, one of the most advanced language plans for mother tongue in the region. The idea is to have a 30-minute presentation, followed each speaker by about 10 minutes of question and answer, and we'll see how much time we have at the end. The first speaker is presenting on language and inclusion, framing the debate. This is by Psyche Kennett, an independent consultant on education, governance, and training. She has worked around the world on education, governance, and development issues at national and subnational levels for the past 30 years, specializing in learner-centered, task-based, inclusive methodology through second language teaching and learning. Her work on language and social inclusion includes new approaches to teaching Tamil as a second language to government servants in Sri Lanka, guidelines for language displacement and stopping school-related gender-based violence, materials development policy for language for resilience for displaced persons, and bilingual teacher training for girls' education in math and science. A wealth of experience. Please, Psyche.
Music. I've got the after lunch slot, so I hope we're awake and alert. I did get a notice into my room saying there's going to be fire alarm practice from 1:30 onwards, so if you hear those alarms ringing, well, that will fit very nicely into my education in emergencies topic. Today, maybe I can have the first, I look like good on profile. Maybe I can have the first slide there. My plenary this afternoon is on framing the debate in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. And first and foremost, I'd really like to thank the British Council and the UNESCO Asia Pacific Multilingual Education Working Group to thank them for bringing me here, and it's an honor. And so, esteemed colleagues, I want to really take the long view. I've been a language and development trustee for a while. I've been working on this for a long time. It's interesting how certain themes keep emerging, and I do feel I have been talking about international development and the actual practical implementation issues of language, education, and inclusion for a few years now. So that really is the focus, taking the long view. And in terms of language and development, I think the first thing is language for development, and that's where the inclusion comes in. The local language, mother tongue-based, multilingual education, and the intersectionality of ethnicity, geography and poverty, rural and vulnerable urban areas, the intersectionality of language with those things, and with gender, and with age. After the 10th Language and Development Conference in Cape Town, there was a very short and useful note that Howell Coleman and Mike Solly and Zakia Sawa drew up called Beyond 2015, 20 Lessons from Cape Town. And that list really summarizes the inclusion issues in language education and development. But the debate over the last 25 years has also been the language of development, the hegemony of colonial and international languages. And perhaps more recently, the participation issue, that if you speak a local language, in governance terms, participation means participating in decisions that affect you. And without those international languages, how can local communities participate in the international development debate? I think we have to be careful also about our idea of inclusion. I was recently working with the EU Disability Forum, and they have a definition for inclusion and disability: enabling an inclusive environment where they will not speak about the specific disabilities. But I come from a school of you have to move from the general to the specific to action. And if we don't address dyspraxia, dyslexia, ADD, and sensory deprivation and language learning, if we don't look at the specifics of those things, I don't think we can move to a practical model of inclusion. So those are sort of all the main ideas underpinning what I want to talk about today. But first of all, just to look at the Sustainable Development Goals and which ones are affected in our conference. The first one, which is the one that everyone refers to, is the Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is the education goal. And I think it's worth noting that the Millennium Development Goal for education was all about access. And as a result, we got bums on seats. But what was actually happening in schools was of very low quality. So the numbers came in, but then there wasn't any quality teaching. And I think the Sustainable Development Goal for education has then moved to the idea of quality and inclusion. Not quite sure what happened there. The second development goal I want to talk about is number 10, which is the economic one. It's the social, economical, and political equality, and how language can include or exclude participation in opportunities for democracy, employment, and social inclusion. I've put those two together because there's a direct link with the education goal and the economic, social, political goal about education for those things. And I've grouped the other two, which I think are relevant for our proceedings in our conference, which are SDG 5, which is the one on gender and girls' education, empowering women and girls, and SDG 16, which is the one promoting justice, peace, conflict transformation, peaceful societies, and good governance. So they go together. And what I want to do in my 30 minutes is just to look at some examples of those 4 Sustainable Development Goals in practice when it comes to language and inclusion. And then I want to discuss a little bit about the issues of implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. Wearing another hat, I moderate the DLOG Secretariat, the Decentralization and Local Governance Secretariat of the EU donors and the World Bank and Asian Development Bank, who meet annually to discuss progress on the Sustainable Development Goals and about localizing them. There's a direct link between localizing the SDGs and local languages, which I'd like to look at some of the issues of implementing those things. And then the issues of implementing language in emergencies for displacement and language in development, and finally, some ways forward. Now it's not moving. Maybe we could move to the next slide. Thank you. The first example I want to look at is one that illustrates SDG 4, and it's a project from that was initiated by the British Council with the National Administration of Public Education, and it started in about 2011. It was the brainchild of Graham Stanley with the British Council, who designed and did the teacher training and quality assurance of this program. Uruguay is one of the few countries in the world that took up the global challenge of 1 laptop per child and actually made it sustainable. It's a blended learning program for English for primary grades 4 to 6. And it specifically reaches out to vulnerable urban schools and remote rural schools where there is no trained English language teacher. Using a really interesting technology, an interesting platform, and interactive classroom video conferencing. It's not like a talking screen on the wall. The teacher can zoom in, do group work, the kids do assignments online. It's a very interesting digital program, and it's reached 93% of all kids in Uruguay, all primary school students in Uruguay. 72% are ones with unqualified English teachers, which have been the focus for the remote program. But on top of that, apart from the digital literacy, it uses special software so that there's better connectivity in the very remote areas where connectivity is a problem. And it uses other software for special education needs and disabilities, including software for dyspraxia, dyslexia, ADD, and sensory deprivation. So it's a very inclusive example. And national assessments have measured the parity between vulnerable and poor area schools and the elites, and uses those national assessments to plan for the future to bring up the parity. The other reason it's a really interesting case is that it's redefined the roles of teachers and learners. The teachers in these classrooms are unqualified in English, so they don't teach. The remote teacher is based in Argentina, even as far as the Philippines. There are 163 remote teachers managed by the British Council, but a lot more in the whole program. Some are in the UK, some in Argentina. So the teachers are not even in the country in many cases. The classroom teacher then becomes a facilitator and a co-learner, and that's had very interesting an interesting dynamic on how teaching and learning is viewed in those classrooms. My second example is the bilingual education program in the autonomous region of Madrid. Again, this is a British Council project which started in about 1996 with a bilingual education program for the whole of Spain. But in 2016, the autonomous region of Madrid went for a full bilingual model. It's an early start model, whole school, and 30% of the lessons, of the 30% of the subjects, apart from Spanish and English, have to be in the second language, in this case, English. They can be geography, chemistry, and so on. The initiative was because, and the reason why I've linked it to SDG 10, is the initiative came from the fact that Spain has 27% unemployment of youth. It also had a very low take-up on second languages, and youth were not interested in English. Up until the national and autonomous region of Madrid bilingual programs, English was seen very much as a privilege of the elite, and they went to private language schools, and private language, English language schools in Spain are famous. But now, with this program, there is parity between the highest quintile and the lowest quintile in exam results in English. But not only that, that kids from vulnerable backgrounds are achieving much higher levels in English than other kids in Spain, and far higher than in other countries in Europe, in 14 countries that were surveyed in Europe. Both the Madrid and the Uruguay case studies show that there is a case for English at early grades if it's done correctly, if the teachers are qualified or quality is assured in a different way. There seems to be no adverse effect for the very early learning in the Spanish model. I'm throwing that out there just as a counterpoint that these issues are complex. And although I definitely espouse multilingual education and mother tongue first, these are interesting examples that we came across in our research. My next examples are about SDG 5 and gender. And unfortunately, I was not able to find any specific gender and language programs to present today. The two that I am presenting are typical of gender projects. I work with the EU Development Cooperation on policy guidance for gender, on stopping school-related gender-based violence, and on girls' education. The first case study is about Balochistan, and it is typical of most gender mainstreaming projects. Gender mainstreaming is a way of not doing gender, I think. It's a development speak approach where you basically consider gender, you data map gender and gender lack of parity, but usually the projects don't get any further than that. In all the EU development projects in education, I didn't find any that were specifically working on curriculum, positive images of girls in curriculum. Pakistan doesn't have any. And the problem is that by finding the data, this is powerful data that they found in Balochistan, and it is that Millennium Development Goal, it's about access. The access increased by 25%, but it didn't go further, or it doesn't go further than that. The project runs out of time and money, and we've got to the starting point rather than the end point. Where's the quality? In Balochistan, the key lack of quality comes from pre-service teacher training, and that's taught in Urdu, although the 4 other languages where the program is happening, it's the biggest and most dispersed and most remote province in Pakistan. They don't speak Urdu in most of the areas where the project is. So there was no consideration of language. The language component was missing. And likewise in the Malawi project, again, typical of gender initiatives for girls' access in education. In Malawi, secondary schools are built in sort of collection points, and they are at a distance from most girls' and boys' homes. And girls tend to walk 15 miles to school, and they get sexually assaulted on the way, on the journey, or they stay in digs near the school, and they get sexually assaulted in their school accommodation. So the Malawian project was addressing that, and it was creating safe school environments for girls. And this is the other typical kind of gender project in education for inclusion. And it was very successful in doing that. Bursaries, bicycles, safe accommodation, getting girls who had dropped out because of early teenage pregnancy back into school. It's highly successful. But part of the safe school environment policy is there should be a guide or a teacher or someone that girls can go to for protection and for advice and for mentoring. And Malawi has at least 16 languages, but again, language was not a feature in this project. So I don't see how you can have a safe school with a guardian who doesn't speak the language of the girl's choice. So in a way, my examples for inclusion of girls' education and language are examples of it not being there. For SDG 16, I'd like to talk very briefly about a project that I'm working on now with my colleagues who I believe are in the audience, and I hope they'll identify themselves, and you might like to talk to them later in more detail. Jnani Wickramasinghe. Jnani, are you here? There. Jnani Wickramasinghe from the Ministry of National Integration and her colleagues, including the Additional Secretary. And Louise Coucher, is Louise here, from the British Council, who is running that project. So the Supporting Reconciliation by Reducing Language Barriers in Sri Lanka is a project about justice, about reconciliation, about conflict transformation. Sri Lanka has 72 bilingual divisions where governance is run in the Sinhala language, but there is a significant majority of Tamil speakers, often poor, working in the plantation sector with very limited education, or war-affected, war-displaced, and with very few resources. And in that situation, the government cannot offer equitable services to the resident poor who need to access foreign employment forms, birth, marriage, death certificates, child protection. The biggest issue is with the police. So this project targets those people, child protection officers, women police officers who deal with domestic violence and missing children, the staff of the divisional and district secretariats, rural development officers, all the people who work with the Tamil-speaking public and don't speak their language, even though the law requires them to. And this is a content and language integrated learning project, multilingual. It uses Tamil and Sinhala on the same page, and it includes social inclusion issues about gender equality, about poverty and the plantation sector, about conflict resolution, about living in an inclusive society and citizenship skills for that through Tamil. But the Tamil is very elementary, it's at a very elementary level. It's elementary to pre-intermediate, where most government service officers tested in. We've developed the first placement test in Tamil that Sri Lanka has had in 70 years, and it finds that the majority, 67% of public servants are this elementary level. So building on that, we are able to deal with what I would call the intersectionality of language rights, gender equality, and just societies, that combination of SDG 5 and SDG 16, to really address some of the more complex issues of inclusion. There's a vicious circle of, if you don't get your name right on your birth certificate in Sri Lanka, and the Sinhalese nurse spells it wrong if you're Tamil, then you don't get your ID card, and then you don't get your passport, and then you can't work abroad to support your family, or you can't claim your land rights, and you certainly can't sign a statement in a police. If you've got a case with the police, you can't sign something that you don't understand. So there's lots and lots of issues that are interrelated. And this quotation, I'll just give you a moment to read it. I can't read it over there, my terrible glasses. When we are admitted to the hospital for treatment, if the hospital is full and there's a shortage of beds, the nurses do not consider our age or the seriousness of our illness and simply ask us